Morning. Did you
We
all resend the link out?
Yes.
We're having a couple challenges.
Okay.
It's always dangerous when these Zoom meetings start and my video is off, but my audio is on.
I don't know why that's the setting. It really
It
bothers
is.
You know, it's that concept that if I can't see myself, no one can hear me.
me.
Yep.
I like to lure you into like a false sense of
Exactly.
welcome. We are here to talk about trauma-informed care. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking beyond the basics, but wanted to, if we go to the next slide, we'll give it a little bit of introduction just to allow more people to trickle in as they come. If you've attended any of our trainings, you probably know who TAC is. We're just a technical assistance collaborative that is a nonprofit organization that works across the nation with human services, healthcare, homelessness systems, really helping people implement policies and practices to empower individuals to live the lives they choose in the community they choose. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just cover a little bit of what we're going to cover today. And so trauma-informed care, we'll do a little bit of an icebreaker. If you've attended trainings with Teresa and I, we love to have people chat. I feel like that's where the real meat and potatoes of this work is. So we would welcome you to come off mute. If you're more comfortable dropping things in the chat, please do. We'll try to keep this as interactive and engaging as possible. So we're going to do a little bit of a refresher of the definition of trauma. And then we'll do a little bit of a refresher of the definition of trauma-informed care and kind of the theory behind it. To facilitate some engagement, we'll do a couple breakout sessions just to allow you to kind of talk through your experience with somebody else doing similar work. And we'll spend some time on delivering services in a trauma-informed way and then also supporting staff in a trauma-informed way, because kind of thinking of trauma-informed work, it's, facing towards the individuals that we work with, but also towards colleagues, towards supervisees, towards supervisors. So kind of thinking holistically about trauma-informed care. And then we will spend time with another breakout group and then spend some times with question and answer. So that's kind of our run of the show today. We know that talking about trauma can trigger things, so please take the time you need as you need it. As we start to talk about things that may trigger things in you, you can go off camera, you can take a break. Just kind of wanted to level set with that. The other logistic thing is you can turn on closed captioning for yourself if you need it. And if you have any technological challenges or anything, feel free to chat Teresa or I, and we can try to resolve it. But I think we wanted to start with just getting a little bit of a baseline of what your comfort level is utilizing trauma-informed practices. So we're going to do a little bit of a poll here just to get a feel for who's in the room. I think often when doing this, we'll go ahead and launch that poll, but often when doing this, sometimes we have people who are really, really familiar. We have people who are new to it. So just getting a little bit of a better feel for your comfort level with utilizing trauma-informed care practices. And so I think that helps us figure out where we want to spend a little bit more time or if we want to lean in somewhere. So we'll let you all answer those questions and then we'll see what kind of the comfort level is in the room.
And right away, almost everyone has answered. So we'll give it just
Awesome.
another minute and we'll wrap this up. So thank you for already being participatory. That's what we want today.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's everyone. So it's looking like most folks are comfortable or somewhat comfortable. So that's great. With the majority being comfortable. So I think that helps us. I can share the results out.
Perfect. All right, so that's helpful. And I think we may give a refresher for some content and then probably spend less time on that and do a little bit more time on digging in, that given that people are a little bit more comfortable. So if we want to go to the next slide, Teresa, do we want this in the chat? So if you want to drop in the chat We're going to do a little bit of an icebreaker, and Teresa and I need to think of what our answer to this is. But if you were on a deserted island, what is one thing you would have to have with you and why? So we'll spend a little bit of time letting people drop that in the chat. Teresa, I don't know if you want to do yours verbally. I haven't thought
Yes.
about mine.
So when Jordan and I were talking about this, we both initially thought we would bring our dogs, but we didn't know if that was like the right answer. Can you bring a living thing with you to this deserted island? I don't know. So the second thing I thought of was I have uh, a hatch, which is, or like it's the grown-up version of the hatch. If you know what a hatch is, it's really for babies. But it's a white noise machine, and I swear that I would never ever sleep if I didn't have this white noise machine. So I would just be on a desert island, also very sleep deprived. So I think that's what I would bring with me. All right, what do we have in the chat?
Seeing things pop in the chat like fresh water, a filter for water. Laura, apparently Teresa and I are not practical. We first thought our dogs. We're not worried about survival. Swiss Army knife, family member or friend, bike. See, the knife is a good move. So we're having lots of people who are thinking very practical survival skills, and then others that are thinking emotional support. Food and water, great. Awesome. Water filter. Yeah, we have very practical people, but I think we're seeing themes of survival skills, and then these are things that I need to support my mental or physical well-being. So I think that's great. Go with dog. Molly's in the boat with us. We're all taking our animals with us. Awesome. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. So thinking through, it sounds like everybody in the room is pretty comfortable or somewhat comfortable with utilizing trauma-informed techniques. But
Is
so
it
we're
out on the
curious,
porch? Good luck.
we're curious
Okay,
as you all think about your work in trauma-informed practices, how has your understanding of trauma evolved through your work? And feel free to come off mute and chat with us about it.
Um, I've learned over time that just the effect of secondary, that transfer is so more real. We believe it is, even when we understand it. And even once you do, you still leave and think you're cool. And then sometimes you're just like taking a shower and you're like, wow, like freaking out.
Yeah, no, 100%. We'll talk about that too. I think it's when and thinking about trauma-informed is how it involves in other people's impact, but also an impact on you, 100%. Other things that people think about of your understanding of trauma and how it's evolved as you kind of gotten more further along in your career?
I think I've learned to be comfortable asking more questions, not making assumptions based on my own experiences or my own expectation of how someone should approach a situation practically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. I feel like, especially in the beginning, I was even scared to talk about it. Like I didn't want to trigger something in someone, and then also not making assumptions and asking the questions because everybody's experience is different. Other ways that you feel like your understanding of trauma might have evolved as you've been in the field a little bit longer?
I think that everybody's heart is different. So like my heart might be, oh crap, I don't have money to go out to eat, but somebody else's heart is they don't have money to pay their power bill. So everybody's example of hard is completely different. It's case by case.
Yeah, 100%. Things are different for different people.
so it was at 9. I'm on now.
I was just coming. I was like, oh, it was 9.
Anybody have any other thoughts about how kind of your understanding of trauma has evolved in the work?
When I started, I wanted to be so careful around trauma. And over time, people have taught me, you still want to be careful, but people have taught me that often, despite really, really significant trauma, they don't want trauma to be an excuse. They recognize it as a thing that is in the way, or is not totally in the way. It is a barrier that together we can move past. But I think until I got comfortable with that, I would be like, okay, we don't have to even touch it because it's trauma. So getting more comfortable to be able to sit into it.
Yeah. I think that, and I think that's a common experience of, how do we handle it? Do I push? Do I not? And how do we walk forward through it together? I think when I think about this question, I also think about like my understanding of what, kind of like John said, for vicarious trauma, like its impact on me, but the impact and pervasiveness of trauma and how just pervasive it is in the work that we're doing and how it shows up and things that originally I wouldn't have, when I started early in my career, I wouldn't have thought were trauma, that now I look back and I'm like, oh, that was totally a trauma response happening, both for myself as John identified, but also for the people I was working with. And so thinking about like, we'll talk a little bit about just recognizing and realizing and all of the 4 R's of trauma informed care. But for the sake of time, I think we'll go ahead and keep going, and I'm going to let Teresa take over.
Okay, so since you all said you were mostly comfortable with this, I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I think as always in these trainings, if you have a question that comes up, either raise your hand, drop it in the chat. It doesn't have to be us talking at you at the whole time. But this is just a framework for how we think about trauma. So we think about the event, and I don't love the word event because I think it's not always an event, right? It could be like racial trauma, it could be generational trauma, it could be a number of things, but think of the event as like the thing that's traumatizing, and that can be, just know that that can be very broad in scope. And then it's the second E is how the individual experiences or makes meaning of the event, right? So if someone, say they were in a really bad accident or something like that, the experience of helplessness can really kind of layer some different impacts of trauma onto a person. The experience of kind of being like stuck, like up, there's a number of different things that could, or I have a good example from my career, which is we had a woman responding to an overdose, and what she did, she froze the first time that she did it. And that's in itself is a trauma response, but it also, interestingly, made the experience more traumatizing because she was like, I froze, I didn't know what to do, I felt incompetent, I felt helpless. And so that made that like a deeper experience for her. And then the third E we think about is the effect. So whatever the lasting impacts of the traumatic event or events are on the person. So those might be immediate, you might be processing that immediately, or like John just described, you might be in the shower and it might pop into your mind and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of having an intrusive thought right now. And not really expecting that it would have impacted you in that way. But those are the 3 E's. And that is a framework for thinking about trauma. So there's the thing that is traumatic. There is a number of different ways that our interpretation or response to that trauma can impact our experience, and that can impact the effect. So to the group, since this is kind of a beyond the basics training, we want to make sure that you're talking because we think that that is kind of what makes it like a 201 instead of a 101. I named some things, but I'm curious to hear from you all. What are some things you think impacts a person's experience of trauma? And what are some things that either exacerbate or ameliorate the effects of trauma on a person? And you can drop it in the chat. You can come off mute, however you feel comfortable responding, but please share your thoughts.
I think that a lot of it too impacts sort of like for us, if like Erica had said, everybody has their own hard. So if we have an experience that has been really hard for us, and that's what the person we're working with presents, it makes it a lot harder than if it's a totally different experience. So how we identify it and how we can either put something past us or not deal with it if it's something that's too familiar to ourselves.
That's a really good point. Let's see. Marissa says support network and access to resources can be helpful. Yes, that's the first thing I think of when I think of what ameliorates the impacts of trauma. I think social support. And then something that could exacerbate lack of coping skills and repeated trauma, I think, is certainly can compound those impacts.
This idea is kind of caught between the two, but it really made me think more dynamically about trauma when I read it. And it's this idea of like somebody, I guess, whoever I was reading was describing this phenomenon where like um, you can have a trauma from being a soldier, you know, at war, and there's like this really challenging disentanglement of that trauma because it can like ironically be infused with some of the greatest sort of like connection memories of your life. And there's like, you know, so you, it's not, the point isn't to say like that's unique to soldiers, but it's to say like your trauma can be embedded with a lot of love. And then it's like, how do you tear that away? It'd be like working on this thing when it's actually like influencing things that are supportive in that person's mind. And that concept really enlivened what trauma is to me.
Yep, that is such a great point. I think that really gets to the complexity and like the layeredness. And like I'll share a personal story. I had a sibling that came back from overseas and they lost someone. They lost someone in front of them. They experienced a great deal of trauma. And when they came back, they all were facing different challenges, but they wanted to be together. Because you're exactly right. It's like we faced this and kind of overcame it together, and we want to kind of we don't want to lose that connection, but also we're all experiencing these very challenging things as a result of what we went through. So that's a really, really good point. Any last thoughts before we move on? Thank you for adding these points to the discussion because I think it's exactly what we're trying to get to today. It's very complicated, and we really want to dig into that.
Well, and I'll just, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'd say like how directly the trauma affects the individual. Like I mean, for example, like 9/11, it was, you know, like a nationwide trauma, which people are, you know, more likely to have, you know, a lesser um traumatic experience rather than like if you personally were like in the airplane or in one of the towers. Um, so it's like it was a, you know, a national trauma, but somebody who was actually there is going to have more of an effect than people that watched it on TV or.
Yeah, really good point. Because it was traumatizing no matter what, but certainly people closer to the experience. And then we had a really good one before we move on in the chat, acknowledgement of trauma by people in their life. So being seen, I think that's really important. I know that we probably all have heard from folks or folks that we work with that when people's trauma is minimized or it's like just get over it or even denied in the worst cases, that can really be impactful.
And Teresa, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that's coming up in these themes that people are talking about is it's the experience and how people assign meaning to something. And so like people assign meaning based on past experience, people assign meaning based on their close family members' reaction, people assign meaning based on, you know, a myriad of reasons, right? And so we're always a product of our environment, often, you know, and so it's why do I tie meaning for that? And so for Anne's comment, maybe sometimes it's because I was closer to it, or maybe it's, you know, so it's looking at why, like how are people tying meaning to the situation? And so that's really kind of part of that experience piece where the same thing could happen to me that could happen to Teresa, and it could have a much larger impact on me because of the meaning I've tied to it. So I think that's coming up in all the themes that are being elevated here.
Yeah, absolutely. And just again, we will not spend a ton of time on this slide because I know folks have probably seen this. But thinking about the different types and levels of trauma, in that 3 E's, like I said, I don't love the word event because it's not always an event, right? So there could be acute, chronic, or complex trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational, ancestral trauma. I've heard a lot of folks kind of being activated now because of some things related to intergenerational and ancestral trauma, because of everything that's going on in the country, relational, racial, and then collective. Um, but I will move on from that because I'm certain that you've probably been exposed to this material before, and we want to get into the stuff that you haven't really talked through yet. Effects of trauma. So chronic trauma and even single incident trauma can dysregulate the nervous system, and we know a number of things happen as a result of that. So you can kind of see on the side of your screen the diagram of the brain. We talk about how it impacts our prefrontal cortex, so rational thinking, emotion regulation, knowing how much of a threat something is, kind of interpreting that. All of that is impacted by trauma, especially chronic trauma over time. And then what's amplified is kind of our survival instinct. So the amygdala, wired for survival. And so we're not thinking rationally, we're thinking about what is it that I need to survive, what is it that I need to be safe. And so that can be more active, whereas our prefrontal cortex can be less active. And I'm sure, as you can all imagine, that creates some significant challenges when we're relating to people, when we're detecting threats in our environment. Often there's threats that are perceived that are not really present, or they're kind of amplified for people. And that's what that hyperarousal looks like. But on the other end of the spectrum, you can kind of see hypoarousal, right? So you can't manage that heightened intensity all of the time. And so you kind of numb out, you dissociate is a coping skill that we see for folks that experience trauma. And I really do like to think of it that way, right? We know dissociation is a challenge, but also it's how someone is coping with being really overwhelmed by their experience. And so it has widespread effects. And then what it ends up looking like in the person is it changes how they perceive the world. So your brain's working differently, you're interpreting the world around you a little bit differently. And this can vary based on the person's experience, but often folks kind of lose that sense of safety. So feeling like the world is more of a dangerous place, it's a bad place. People are unpredictable, people can't be trusted, and then just generally, like, I don't feel like my life is predictable. Views about self. I shared that story about a colleague. She felt like she was incompetent. She most certainly was not. Um, Judging, self-judgment. I should have reacted differently. Feeling overwhelmed. I can't handle this. Or feeling damaged by what happened to you. And then, of course, views about the future, kind of feeling like hopelessness. Of course, like if you feel like the world's a bad place, you might not feel hopeful about the future. Feeling like you'll never be able to manage this, are things that come up often. And I think things that we certainly see with folks in the work that we're doing. And again, this is, I'm sure, very familiar to you, but all of that together, so changes in our brain, our changes in the belief about the world around us, about others, about ourselves, you end up, all of that together ends up looking like one of these kind of 6 responses, right? And so you have fight or flight or freeze. Those are the ones I think that we've all heard a bunch of times, but you also might see please and appease if it feels safer to you to make sure that everyone around you is not angry with you or upset with you. You might kind of fall back into that type of behavior, just making sure everyone is fine so nothing can happen. Attaching, crying for help, wanting to be rescued, feeling like your circumstances are too overwhelming to manage on your own, and then kind of collapsing and submitting, which is where you might see a little bit of that feeling like helpless, of feeling like you don't have control over your situation. And so kind of like passivity, but kind of in a way that's really negatively impacting a person's life. And so I think I myself over my career, and I think Jordan touched on this a little bit earlier, I started to notice trauma showing up in folks in different ways than I expected. And so I want to pose the question to the group, what are some of the ways that you noticed trauma showing up in the people you serve? And I'm thinking more like, are there any that were surprising to you that you didn't anticipate experiencing?
Open, and then if you can text me and let me know if they do, I can send if you can get
And again, you can do it in the chat, you can come off mute, whatever it is that feels most helpful.
think it's always really surprising when somebody self-sabotages in a way that's like pretty measurable, you know.
Yep, maybe the new experience feels too threatening, and so you do something to not have to go through that experience. I think that shows up a lot. We see in the chat, I have one client whose go-to was to scream, yell, cry, and become aggressive, all because she was scared. Yeah, if I'm aggressive, that's putting distance between me and you. And if I feel like you might be threatening to me, I've succeeded in keeping you at arm's length, right? I think Molly, yours is really good and one that we see all the time, frequent hospital visits for containment. Like if people are feeling out of control and feeling like that is a contained, safe space. And yeah, do you know, once she let that out, she was able to communicate. So kind of seeing that you actually weren't threatening to her. And we have Michelle, a lot of clients who have a hard time telling the truth, right? And we can understand that, right? Because there's often a lot of shame attached to the traumatic experience, but also like Jordan's point, there's a lot of shame attached sometimes to the meaning they attach to the traumatic experience. Like, oh, I can't manage this. I'm incompetent or whatever it is. Shutting down, self-sabotage, not being able to follow through on things. Substance use, we saw that submit. There's also like numbing out with substance use is a very, very common thing we see with folks who have experienced trauma, especially complex trauma.
I'll just add, I think something we see sometimes too is hyper independence. And so I think some of it is reality based and some of it is trauma based. And we see it sometimes when people move into housing after maybe they've been living unsheltered for a really long time. And then I don't need help. I don't need you. I've got this. We're all. And so it eventually over time they start to open up and say like, I'm really struggling with this, or I'm really, but a lot of times it's, I don't need anybody, and kind of taking it back to that worldview, because I think this is going to be a common theme when we talk about trauma. It disrupts your worldview. It was, I can't trust anyone. I have to do it myself. I won't. And so that inability to let people in was because repeated trauma has told me I can only rely on myself and I will only rely on myself.
Yep, that's definitely one we see all the time. I experienced, when we're talking about ones that are surprising, I experienced kind of the opposite of that with one person I was working with. They were so concerned about my safety in completely safe situations, like all of the time. And I didn't really understand it. And when we were kind of talking about it in clinical groups, folks would be like, well, I think they're, turning their attention to you because they're avoiding what they have to do. Eventually it came out that person was just like, I've just seen too much. I see threats everywhere. And so he was just genuinely concerned all the time about the person in his presences. It's nothing specific to me about their safety. And I thought that was an interesting way that trauma came out.
I also I feel like a lot of the more what society views as negative is quite common reaction to trauma, but I've had some specifically refugee families who, there's some sort of interaction that they have with me and they designate me as a safe person so that it becomes like they will only trust me to do anything, and it becomes an over dependent piece. So really trying to work on how do we trust other people, or how do we navigate what we think is trustworthy and is safe, not just me. And yeah. That's
Right.
a trauma response.
And I think you see that all the time. And I think that goes to Jordan's point, right? Is like, if the world is unsafe, I'm only letting in people one by one, maybe. And so how do I work on expanding that network and that giving people my trust? I also see Ryan put in the chat hoarding. Yes, you see that all the time. I see that a lot with food. I think one of the most common things I saw folks hoard when moving from living outside to inside was hoarding food because they often didn't know when their next meal was coming from. But that can translate into possessions. That can translate into a number of things, because often when they were outside, they didn't have what they needed when they needed it. And so they're preparing for that. And that's it's a perceived threat to them not having what they need. And we also have another one that says, will not answer phone and emails. Scared of making the wrong decision. So that's a great example of how it's changed their thoughts about themselves, right? They don't have that self-trust and that self-belief that they're able to make decisions. And so that can be really, it can make you freeze up and not want to make the decision. I think that's really an understandable thing. Thank you for all of these really good examples. And I think I'm passing it to you, Jordan, at this point.
I also see just one more that came in the chat, self-sabotage of housing opportunity and resources, hoarding behavior, folks quickly rebuilding their amount of things. Absolutely. And I think, that is a very common response to trauma is this has happened before. I want to prevent for it and plan for it and not, lose anything in the future. So that's definitely part of a trauma response. So thinking about trauma-informed, we're going to talk a little bit about the theory and then like practically what does it mean. So if you want to go to the next slide, Teresa, when you all think about trauma-informed care, what does it mean to you? And I think we asked this because I feel like trauma-informed care is thrown around a lot and it's become a little bit of a trite phrase sometimes in the work of trauma-informed care, harm reduction, but we really want to dissect. What does it actually mean? What does it mean to be trauma-informed? And so for you personally, when you think about trauma-informed care, what comes to mind?
Realizing that everybody has a different experience with the world, and what might seem small to say myself is really big, and it could be a big trigger to somebody else. So just realizing that we're not all the same and we don't all go through life and experiences the same.
Absolutely. It's a great summary. Anybody else?
I think there's a commitment to learning, where you're like, you're just aware after so many adaptations that your best position is to be open-minded when you encounter trauma.
Absolutely. We're seeing themes of opening up, being aware of different perspective, different worldviews, and then being aware of the impact of trauma on people and being sensitive and that difficult behaviors are maybe the response to a trauma. Absolutely.
Practicing mindfulness is kind of what you're saying as well, but just putting that out there too, just being really in check with yourselves and where you're at so you can be as aware and on board with supporting people, meeting them where they're at.
And this is why I like to do this, because trauma-informed care is a term we use all the time, but when you unpacked it, it's all these thousands of things that I'm thinking mindfully. I'm also keeping this in perspective. I'm trying to analyze what might be going on behind the behavior. So, thousands of things are happening when you talk about trauma-informed care. And I think mindfulness is a great term to bring intentionality around how am I approaching people, knowing that there's a different worldview, there's a different perspective, active listening and not passive. I see another trauma response coming in. Clients have discomfort with being inside 100%. So I think a lot of behaviors can be unpacked and looked at what might be related to trauma. And I think this gets back to what somebody put in the chat earlier, which is really thinking about the pervasiveness of trauma and how it might impact an individual. So for the sake of time, I'll go to the next slide and we'll give you what the actual definition is. But I think the reason I like to unpack it is, it's a strength-based framework that's grounded in understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma. And knowing that trauma, everybody usually experiences some type of trauma. And so it's an understanding of the pervasiveness of that, that it has a physical, psychological, emotional impact. And so really trauma-informed practices are really thinking about the safety, both for the provider and the individual who's experienced trauma, and it's a strategy to help someone rebuild their sense of control. And so it involves individuals, it involves agency, it involves policy, it involves practice, and it's really an ongoing practice. And I think part of why these trainings are so helpful is I think intuitively, as the things are coming up, we know all of this, but to Katrina's point, it's about mindfulness, it's about intentionality. Sometimes when we're going through the motions, we might miss things just because the world's on fire and we're jumping from one crisis to the next to the next. So really these trainings are about pausing and being kind of intentional in some of this. And so I think that's kind of really what trauma-informed care is it's a strengths-based framework that really thinks about the pervasiveness of trauma and how we're responding to it. We want to go to the next slide. So when thinking about this, we're going to spend some time on the 4 Rs. And so the 4 Rs of trauma-informed care are realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. And I think it's really the mindset of doing trauma-informed care. So realizing is understanding the widespread impacts of trauma. And this has already come up in the conversation. Trauma is not an isolated incident. It ripples through lives across generations. It leaves, emotional, psychological impacts that can really shape the person's worldview. And so a lot of what we've spent time talking through when we're talking through what is trauma, what does it look like, is really enhancing our realization of the impact of trauma and that it is widespread and pervasive. But it requires us to engage in sessions like these where we regularly talk about it, where we bring it to our active consciousness, because as Katrina said, sometimes if we're not mindful, we may miss it in the day-to-day. But I think it's also part of it's crucial to stay kind of informed in in updated research and what's happening around theories. What are we learning more about trauma? I think as time evolves, we learn more and more about its impact, how it presents. And I think also realizing that it's more prevalent for people who have marginalized identities. And so the next R is really recognizing symptoms of trauma for those you're working with. And I feel like we spent a lot of time unpacking what those signs and symptoms might be. I think, we all may know the classic signs and symptoms, but even as we were working through, there were still things coming in the chat of, oh, this was actually, a trauma response, or this is what we've seen. So recognizing not only the acute signs and symptoms, but kind of those lingering impacts and effects, and how is it showing up today? And, how is it shaping their worldview, and what might be happening behind the scenes? So really thinking about how trauma presents differently across different individuals, that it's influenced by age and culture and background and personal history, all the things that have kind of come up and we've talked about. So we've really already kind of been working through some of these Rs. And thinking about responding. Responding is how do we use this knowledge that we've gathered, looking at the widespread impact and knowing that sometimes things that don't appear to be trauma in the beginning may be trauma. So taking the knowledge of that and then integrating it into our policies, our practices, to really support that individual in their healing process. And I think it's important here to note, responding, we're not treating the trauma. We're responding in a way that promotes resilience and helps that person with healing. But we're trauma-informed care in and of itself is not treatment. It's, you know, an approach that helps that person move forward in resilience. And so I think it requires in creating intentional safety for that person. And we'll spend a lot of time talking through safety and what that looks like. And I feel like you all probably spend a lot of time in everyday practice thinking about safety and what that looks like. But thinking from practice all the way up to the policy level. And then resisting re-traumatization. So again, intentionality and mindfulness in efforts to create a safeguard against re-triggering symptoms or responses of trauma. And how do we refine our approaches based on where we might be seeing things triggering or re-triggering somebody. So thinking through those, are there any other parts of the 4R that you think of or that you feel like it would be helpful to elevate here? Okay. We are going to spend some time diving in a little bit deeper into the 4Rs. And I think we want to do this for all the reasons we talked about, really that intentionality and grounding yourself in some of the work. So we're going to do a little bit of a breakout and we want to talk through some of the questions. We'll drop them in the chat as well. But thinking about realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. So for realize, we want you to think about how did you come to realize some of those challenging behaviors were rooted in trauma? So what did it take for you to realize that? What was happening? And then recognize, how do you recognize when your own trauma has been activated in a professional role? And I think this gets to maybe what John was talking about, where you're in the shower and suddenly you're like, ah, because you didn't recognize it until it was the teapot was going off and it was bubbling over. So how do you recognize your own trauma or your own past experiences are getting activated? For respond, we want you to think about how you continue to have a positive relationship with someone in a trauma-informed way. And then what steps are you taking to avoid re-traumatization? So we can drop those questions in the chat, but we're gonna have you all do it kind of as an individual group. So we'll go into breakout rooms and just talk a little bit about these questions and what you're doing in your current practices. I'm going to drop them in the chat.
I'm going to open the rooms.
Teresa, are we going to take a little break at some point or do we just go on our own?
It is only 2 hours, so we didn't have a break built in, but we would encourage you to take them if you need them because it also is 2 hours. I don't know. It's like one of those length trainings where you don't really know where to put the break. So
That's
yeah,
okay.
by
Yeah,
all
thank
means.
you.
My screen not sharing. Okay, yes, it is.
Are sharing.
Okay.
I feel like there was a lot of really great conversation happening. We kind of ripped people out of there.
I know.
I feel like that's the challenge with doing a trauma-informed care training is there's, a lot of content to cover. Anything people want to share out based on their group of things or themes that started to come up? I will say in our group, as we were leaving, we were kind of talking about the tension of safety of staff and safety of the individuals we serve, and then also talking about, when you're putting a lot of work into something and then the person may appear to self-sabotage based on responses, and then how do you recover from that? And it's disheartening to put in all this work and then have the situation not work out, and kind of balancing some of that, and how does that maybe trigger past experience of staff as well.
We also talked about that, or like kind of the tension between wanting to help move someone forward and then them not showing up for whatever reason, and how that can be frustrating for us, but we need to think about why that might be, and then adjust our approach based on that clinical curiosity.
Ryan made a point that I thought went into something as a reflection back and forth between us, that like the you just because you learn and build a greater context for an individual doesn't mean you should move your boundary of what you're willing to hear and receive from them. And that does happen a lot where you're like, now that I know that, I'm gonna like be in this corner getting like yelled and spit at because I'm like aware, and you're like, you got to be like balancing that, and it's really hard to do.
Think that's a great point. And, knowing context is helpful, but sometimes in intervention, knowing context is to hold that ground, right? Where your past learning is you've learned that I continue to do this and that's how I survive. And so my intervention is I'm going to hold this boundary. I know and I respect where you're coming from, but I'm going to change your narrative a little bit, right?
Yeah, and I think it can just get really slippery. Like I think early on in this work, I recall meeting a couple of people, and like one of them being like, I have like oppositional defiance, so like I'm gonna escalate, and you got to be like ready to hold that, and me being like pretty young and in it, just being like, yeah, like I'll withstand a lot of being yelled at, and just you kind of have to like know where, like how to be consistent with people, and it's like I can change that I expect that's gonna happen, but I'm not gonna like increase my measure of withholding it just because I know that about you.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's a really good example. And I think the other thing we don't always think about when we're talking about like holding that boundary is those boundaries make you predictable to the person. And that's actually something that can be um healing for someone that's experiencing trauma, because they may have engaged in that type of response many times. And if they may have gotten all kinds of responses from whoever they were doing it to, from safe to very unsafe. And so holding that kind of safe boundary, saying, well, we're not going to do this, but it makes you predictable to them. And that's
Yeah.
actually a good thing for folks.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily know if this language works, but just like on my end, I think of it where I'm like, I'm not gonna let you burn this bridge. Like now that
Yeah.
you've told me that, the thing we're gonna do is like actually the opposite. Like you're more so gonna need to find a time when that's not happening, because I'm not gonna let that pattern repeat itself, which is
Yep.
pretty common in this work. Like, that pattern plays out a lot. Somebody
Yes.
prompts you, they're like, I'm gonna get intense and you're gonna go away. And you're like, well, I'm not gonna like withstand your intensity and stay, but we're gonna manage your intensity so that I can stay. Those are two different things.
Yep. Yep. It's a great example.
Teresa, I think I'm handing it back to you.
You are. So now that we've talked a little bit about the theory and kind of a lot of thinking about what's underlying some of folks' presentations, we're going to talk about service delivery and some practical ways, which I anticipate so many of them you're already doing and practicing. But I want us to dig in a little bit deeper and start thinking about not just like what you're doing to be trauma informed, but like why is it important that I do this on a regular basis? The boundaries were a great actually segue and example. So let's start with what's one thing you're already doing to practice trauma informed care or ensure that you're providing trauma informed care. And again, chat, come off mute, whatever it is that you feel comfortable doing.
So I meet the person like where they're at. So I ask them, do you prefer to work or do you prefer to meet in the mornings or in the afternoons? Do you want to meet at, the here at the drop-in center or at in your room or at, a park or outside? So I give them options of, where they would like to meet and, the time.
Yeah, that's great. We're gonna when we start getting into the strategies, choice is something that's really important. Choice and being able to talk about what their preference is.
Yeah, kind of allowing them in the driver's seat as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some other ways?
I think once establishing where you're going to meet, how often you're going to meet, and you start to get to know them a little bit, I would periodically just kind of check in. How does this plan sound to you?
Yes.
What are the issues that you see with this? Can you see yourself following through? Where do you think your hurdles and barriers are going to be? And how can I help get you through that? Or how can we navigate around that if we need to?
Yes, I love that. It's that co-creation, it's partnership, it's asking for feedback, which I think is important. And I think one thing we talked about in our breakout group is kind of making sure that people have choice, but also like the opportunity to kind of tell you, like if they're in like the appease kind of trauma response, providing opportunities to challenge that narrative, right? So I'm asking for your feedback. I'm welcoming you telling me if something's not going to work. I'm welcoming you telling me if something is wrong, like opening that dialogue so that because we heard a lot about like people will just say like yes you to death because they want to be liked by you or they want to appease you, they want to avoid upsetting you, and how that can be counterproductive. And so opening up that discussion I think is really, really great. And then we have in the chat talking to them about expectations. Yes, that's that predictability, knowing what to expect and showing up and following through our caring is not conditional, right? That's right. So consistency, reliability. And then I think to kind of weave that in with what John had said. So something might happen and I might have to set a boundary and I might not, we might have something, but I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about that and we're going to progress from there. Those are all really good examples. Right, just for time, we're going to move in, but if you want to continue dropping them into the chat, you are welcome to. So just for a little framing, you may have already seen this also, but the 6 principles from SAMHSA of trauma-informed care, the most important is safety. And when we're talking about safety, we're talking about for people we're serving, but we're also talking about for ourselves because we can't effectively provide services if we're not feeling safe. And so it's creating, all those different levels of safety, physical safety, psychological safety, everything in between. And that is kind of the foundation from which we deliver trauma-informed care. Trustworthiness and transparency, someone already said this in the chat, follow through, do what you say you're going to do. That helps with that predictability and it helps, again, with safety, actually. It's something that helps people feel safe. They know what to expect. Peer support, helping people feel like they're not alone in their experience. And so if it's something that's relevant to you, using your lived experience when appropriate, but also if, you know, that's not something that applies to you, maybe connecting folks with something like that to kind of decrease that stigma, decrease that shame they experienced with what they may have gone through. Collaboration and mutuality, you guys are all, you're hitting all of these. So someone already said this also. So really like co-creating goals, co-creating what the steps towards addressing those goals might be, letting them either be in the driver's seat or kind of walking together versus kind of the very old school thinking traditional approach of saying like, I know what's best as your care provider, and so I'm going to be prescriptive. And then trying to reduce those power dynamics. I think, you know, we can't eliminate them, but really we're walking together. I don't have control over you. I'm not going to attempt to have control over you because that can certainly be re-traumatizing. Empowerment, voice and choice, and so autonomy and partnership. And then, of course, it's all in a frame of reference, right? So making sure that we're thinking about the cultural, historical, and other, like we say gender here, but isms that might be underlying someone's challenges. So that's that collective trauma, that's that systemic racism, sexism, ableism, all of the isms, and how that's impacted a person. And that's like another layer to the trauma that they're experiencing. So keeping those in mind, we're kind of going to move through the next few slides. And this slide here is really just, it's really just a reminder. You may have seen this if you were at our motivational interviewing training in our assertive engagement training, but it's just to remind us that the folks that you all are working with likely are not going to have their basic needs met. So they're still potentially active, not, don't even want to say potentially, they're very likely actively being traumatized in their environment because they're not getting their needs met. They may not know where they're eating or sleeping that night. People don't get treated well when they're sleeping on the street. So just kind of um, remembering that, and I use that to frame kind of like, okay, so what are the limits of the safety we can create, right? We're working towards getting them closer to getting their basic needs met on a regular basis. There's certainly things that we can do, but in the context of someone who's maybe sleeping outside, we need to really think about the safety within the context of the relationship, and that psychological safety, because at that point, we might not be able to control that environment. We're working towards getting them into a better environment, but the environment they're in right now is not the safest. And even in folks who are utilizing shelter, right? There's a lot going on in shelters, and we can't always attend to all of it, and it might not feel safe for a number of reasons. So we're going to talk a little bit about creating safety, and this quote, "Safety is the most basic task of all. Without sense of safety, no growth can take place." And all of your energy is going to go to defense in those survival strategies, right? So to the group, again, I'm really appreciating everyone's participation. In your work and in your roles, who defines what is safe? Or how do you come to a shared understanding of that with a person?
I feel like there's a couple of different levels of it. There's office safety.
Yep.
There's environmental safety. No, we're not gonna, meet in your motel room, for instance, or something like that. There's certain guidelines and rules that your agency may impose. And then there's also the conversation you have with the client that you're working with regarding what they feel is safe, and how you can respond to that within the guidelines of the program and the services you're there to offer.
Yep, absolutely. And that's kind of exactly what we were getting at, Travis, is there's lots of different levels and sometimes lots of different, I don't want to say competing, but sometimes they can be competing things that we have to do to create safety for everyone that's involved in this process. So that's exactly where we were going. And was a nice segue into the next question, which is how might an agency's definition of safety or the kind of the things that we put in place differ from the person we're working with sense of safety? And I think we're trying to get at that tension there, in how we navigate that, because that is that's a big challenge, at least in my experience. I don't know what other folks think.
Well, one of the things is like a lot of times people want to have privacy, they want to have comfort, and you're like the person said earlier, you might be their safe person and they might not trust other people around, but how in that situation, if you're in a meeting spaces and things like that, do you stay safe and follow your rules when you know that you maybe can't be alone or can't be in a place where they feel like they're the safest because of that? And we've had a lot of conflicts with that and a lot of conversations, and then when there's outside people like in your agency, if you're a lot of times if we feel like there's somebody who might be a problem, um or complicated in those ways, that we would meet like in our conference room and there would be a lot of windows where people could see in, so we could make sure staff is safe. But then in some instances that just makes it really hard, and other people's impression of what's going on and what's safe makes it really complicated too, because you might feel like you're in control of a situation and that you're totally safe, and other people might see what's happening and be really freaking out about it. And if there's no good way of communicating that you're okay, sometimes as a provider, sometimes that's been something we have struggled with in our office a lot.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And I mean, I think in thinking of those competing like needs for safety, the person served might feel a little less safe if there's lots of windows around and people can kind of see what's going on. And you also need to be safe. And if your experience with this person is that you need someone to be nearby or to be visible, then it just creates a tension. And that's not to say you should ever compromise your safety. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that that tension exists, and that acknowledging that can be really important. Or I think, Travis, the example you used is really good. You might not feel safe going into someone's hotel room to meet. That person might really struggle feeling safe outside in the world. And so navigating that is just something, that always is going to come up in this work, I think. And so I guess when you think about these tensions, what are some creative strategies that you can use to problem solve there? And knowing that there are situations in which it may not always be possible, right? But when it is possible, like what are some things you've tried? What are some adjustments you've made, to address that? So like one thing I think of is, Ramsey, if they, and I don't know if this applies to the situation or not because I wasn't there, but if they were feeling unsafe in a room, kind of with that fishbowl feeling, do we meet outside in a park where it feels like less of that is present? And so you're still outside, you're still preserving your safety, you're still in the presence of others, should anything happen, but not in the fishbowl. And, it depends on your agency, it depends on your practices, what's possible, but I'm curious, what folks have tried.
I think just it goes along with that, but like the way you set yourself up in proximity, has a lot to do with it. And whether you're outside or inside, like nobody should be, their desk should not be set up such that you're like, I can't get out,
Yep.
And if you're at ease and your body language is genuinely at ease because you're like, if something happens, I'm out, and then that person can feel at ease. But you also don't want them feeling trapped. But there's a way to position an office so that everybody feels like they can split if they
Yep.
need to.
Yep.
And, I was just going to remark on how also, like, in addition to all this, like, it's confusing when you could have two people with a similar temperament of threat, but like somebody's just really big, or something, and you're
Mhm.
like, oh, I'm treating you different because you could just do harm to me. And that's like sometimes intense where you're like, you can feel more relaxed around somebody where you perceive them as less of a threat,
Yeah.
even though they're more threatening to you, and like
Yep.
that continuity can be kind of curious. But my point is to make like yourself in a universal space so that everybody's not like, oh, that big guy's coming. Let's go to that room where we feel safe. Just making
Yep.
a space where you're like, I never get myself in that situation under any circumstances is ideal.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I very distinctly remember working with the gentleman that was like 6'5" and also just like really broad and huge. And he got treated very differently. And we tried to think about a lot of ways because he knew he was being treated differently is the other thing. And so you don't want to come in with like, I think you're going to hurt me. That's
Yeah.
not going to build that relationship. And so we thought of a lot of different strategies to try to work with them. So it didn't feel like we were messaging that and acknowledging at the same time, like, he's over a foot taller than me, and like, we do know he has some stuff that comes out sometimes. And so what do we do about that?
Yeah.
Any other thoughts before I move on?
I think a lot of it is like past experience too.
Yep.
Because I've personally have worked in a lot of fields with a lot of individuals on the whole spectrum of safe or unsafe individuals. And so like me being able to keep myself safe in a certain situation is completely different than, another coworker or a community member who hasn't, either learned the tools, like I think it was Erica had said, tone of voice and body language.
Yep.
So once you have learned those and, if you feel safe yourself, then it's completely different than what somebody else could view as being safe or not safe.
Yep, that's a really good point. And yeah, if you haven't developed those skills, and I think you were saying that too, Ramsey, like it might be perceived as unsafe when if you've worked with this person or know them long enough or feel confident enough in the situation that you might not actually have that same perception of threat, and that there's so many factors that go into that. Yeah. Thank you, Anne, for bringing that up. Okay, just to move on because I don't want to cut us short again. So just a few things about creating psychological safety, and I'm only going to touch on a few because I think you said most of them. So remember that power sharing, trying to approach the work in a way that doesn't feel like a person, like you have power over the person. We know in trauma, a big contributor to how people experience it is that feeling of powerlessness. So what can we do to level those power dynamics and engage in a shared decision-making process? Those boundaries that John was talking about, that was such a good example. I'm just going to leave that one, but boundaries that promote healing, right? Boundaries that are not too rigid, not too porous, make you predictable, and are reasonable. Following through, honoring when people say no, understanding it's a process. And it might be no indefinitely. It might be no, I'm not ready right now, but having that conversation, kind of being an emotional container, promoting people's voice and choice that they have. We talked a little bit about dignity of risk in the last training. They have the right to try and fail. And they have the right to make choices that we might consider risky. And, there's the very end of that continuum, which is people are making such bad choices that their well-being is really at risk. And we're not talking about going over there, but we're talking about those choices that we all get to make that may have inherent risk in them. So doing with folks, if that's possible, instead of doing for all the time, to build that self-efficacy and kind of that trust in themselves again, that self-belief, of course, the non-judgment. We don't want to contribute to the stigma and the shame. I forget who, it might have been you, Casey, who said this, but asking for feedback until the person is comfortable giving it, if they're one of those folks that appeases. And then creating shared agreements about how service delivery is going to go. One I think about is like, okay, if you do have a blow up and like I have to leave, like if that's, exploring, has that happened with past providers? What should we do if that happens? Like if, you get to a space where, we're able to have a conversation later on, like how should we reapproach re-engaging in services if that's what makes sense? And then raising your conscious awareness about delivering in trauma-informed care and understanding why these seemingly small things that we do when we're delivering trauma-informed care are so important to the person that we're delivering services to. And so the next few slides, we're going to kind of go through some strategies. We will send these slides out, so we won't go through every single strategy because like I said earlier, anticipate you're doing these every day, but I want us to kind of like bring the why into the forefront of our minds instead of just like, I know this is the right thing to do. I know this is best practice. My years of experience tell me that this is best practice, but let's dig into why it would be really important to someone who's experienced trauma. And probably, like we said, the folks we're working with currently actively still experiencing trauma. So what are some things that would be important to a person who's experienced trauma, who's continuously experiencing trauma? If you think about the way you deliver your services or your approach to the work, what are some things that you think would be important to that person? Something went in the chat.
Yeah, choices, control,
Choices and control.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Honesty.
Honesty, transparency, huge. Yes. Control, strengths, yes. Predictability, and making relationships. Yep. Yes. Safety, understanding, and autonomy. All of these are what we're going to really dive into in the next few slides. So you're all right on the money. Okay. So here you can see power and control. Restoring power and control is something that's really important to folks who've experienced trauma because often the reason they are traumatized is they experienced something that it was beyond their control. It was beyond their control or their ability to cope, right? So what are some things, and I'm not necessarily asking you to think big, I'm asking you kind of to think small. What are some little things that you do in your practice that restores power and control in the relationship? And I want you to think about this because this is what we're getting at with like the why is it important? It might be a very little thing that you're doing, but it's empowering the person and it's restoring power instead of removing power. And that's actually really important to folks who have experienced trauma. Yep. Give them some choice for sure. Yep. I see more, of course, choice, right? Because you're giving them some control over how services are going to be delivered. Yep, depersonalizing it. I think it's not going to hurt my feelings if you don't want to meet with me this week. Like, yep. Okay. So, one of the basic ones that I'm sure that you all do if you're working with folks outside, or even if you're working with folks who have a room or whatever it is, ask permission to enter someone's space. Oh, and I see in the chat, Marissa said, give them the chance to do the task on their own. Yes, we talked a little bit about that before, doing with or giving them the opportunity to do something instead of always doing for, because it builds that sense of self-trust and capacity again. Giving permission, like thinking about the assessment process, giving permission not to answer questions. And I think someone else said, it's not going to hurt my feelings. It's not about me. If you're not comfortable answering this question, that's fine. Really, lots of permission, asking them if they need to take breaks, giving that feedback that we've talked about several times already, co-creating. this one is pretty specific, so I do want to touch on it, utilizing psychiatric advance directives. So we are working with folks who may at some point need to access hospital level care. And they may have experienced, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that even if it's the right decision, even if that's what's needed in the moment, that experience can be traumatizing, whether it's voluntary or not. Especially when it's not voluntary, but even when it's voluntary, it can be traumatizing. And so when you're creating crisis plans with folks, having that discussion about psychiatric advance directives, are there any hospitals you really want to avoid? Is there any medications that gave you a really bad reaction that you can work with the receiving facility to discuss? All of those things are really important because I think we sometimes take for granted, because we want to preserve people's safety, that even if we're preserving a person's safety by having them access that level of care, it still can be traumatizing. And having that discussion up front also gives them a sense of power and control in that situation when they might have a lot less control. At least we're gonna be honoring what they've set forth in those advanced directives. Okay. Oops. So what about predictability? What are some things, and I saw one in the chat that I think actually moves us on to predictability, excuse me. What are some things that you do to enhance predictability for folks? And why, I guess the other question, why is predictability important for folks that have experienced trauma? And you can also come off mute if you want to. Yeah, that's a really good point, Molly. It feels good to the brain that has to work so hard to juggle all that stimuli, that those perceived threats. And it's something that you don't have to attend to. If you know what to expect and you know what's going to happen, and you're kind of in that hyper arousal, attending to everything else in your environment to see if there's a threat there, knowing that there's something you don't really have to, I don't want to say attend to again, but assess for, or whatever, you don't have to predict whether or not something is safe. And again, some of these you've already talked about, which is setting expectations, outline what will happen, being reliable and consistent, plan to come back and debrief or re-engage, like, hey, I'm still going to be your provider, even if there's kind of a rift here, or we have to do, I have to disengage for a moment, or you experience a crisis. And then someone put this in the chat just now, but the environment is something that, when it's possible, we want to attend to. So is there privacy? Asking permission again, is it okay to have this conversation here? Are there things in the environment that could be perceived as threatening? And so really attending to that, especially when we're in encampments or working with folks outside. What about transparency? What are some things you do in your practice already to promote transparency?
And I think some of these are coming in the chat because all of these are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, they intertwined. And so like Marissa put in, like, explaining why you're asking specific things. So I think some of these are already coming up in some of the conversation around because how do you give people control? You're transparent in what you can do and what you can't do, and you ask the questions otherwise. So I think some of these are already things that you're doing and bringing up that are both giving the person power back and being transparent in the process.
Yeah, Jordan's right. They kind of go hand in hand. And sometimes it feels like you could put these strategies in any one of these buckets because they really communicate or promote all of the above, right? So I think one really important one is outline what your limits are to confidentiality. Explain in detail, like I used to get so frustrated by this when I was supervising a program when we did consents for release of information. I feel really strongly that you should explain every category of what you're consenting to. So we don't on the back end end up with a conversation with someone they didn't want you to talk to, or I didn't want you to talk to them about that. And that creates kind of like a rift or some mistrust in the relationship. So really, like, what are they consenting to? That's really important. I think it's easy sometimes to breeze through the releases and just check all the boxes, because we have tons of paperwork sometimes up front. But them knowing what they're consenting to exactly, I think is really important. And discuss your limitations. So like in a crisis, what are my limitations? What can I do? What can't I do? What might I have to do if things got to a level that felt unsafe? And then transparency and documentation. I think this is another one that we sometimes take for granted, especially if we're documenting anything while we're in the session with them. If there's someone who has concerns around what you're writing down, you should be able to document in a way that you can show it to them. So there shouldn't be anything in your documentation that they don't know about, even if it's something that's a difficult conversation. So making sure there's a process for access to that is also really important. And then lastly, moving beyond survival. So trying to, even though some might still be in unsafe environments, trying to move beyond just meeting those survival needs. So discussing needs and preferences, I think, is important. We kind of tend to focus on the things that are kind of really pressing, but we don't always pause and ask for people's preferences. Making sure we are, though, thinking about social determinants of health. We're thinking about how they're going to get fed. We're thinking about where they're going to sleep, or if there's anything they can do to make their current sleeping situation more safe. Working towards housing, of course, a goal of this program. Focusing on maximizing those strengths in their supports and building that self-efficacy and community. Being flexible. Involving natural supports. Again, what is it going to look like beyond me just surviving through this situation? What am I going to do to build a meaningful life? And then questions about resilience and just making sure we're not too deficit focused. Any thoughts on those strategies before we move on to kind of how we can engage in a way that is healing? And again, this is not trauma treatment at all, right? And which is appropriate for this group because you're not clinicians in this role for this program.
And Ryan kind of put in the chat balancing holding expectations and holding hope, because reality is in this work, there's often wait list and it's going to be a process. And so wanting them to know it's going to be long, but also balancing that, like, we want to hold hope that housing is possible. And so kind of maintaining both of those at the same time.
Yep. Thank you. My chat was not popping up, so thank you for monitoring that, Jordan. But yeah, that's a really, really good example and a good point. So next we're going to shift a little bit to talking about healing-centered engagement. And so, like I said, this is not trauma treatment. It's a way of engaging that promotes all of those things that we were just talking about. And I did include the link that will go out when you get the slides, because this could be a whole other training, honestly, but it's kind of healing-centered engagement is what we think about when we say, okay, we're going to think about the life that the person is building beyond the trauma they've experienced, especially I think as people get into housing and they start to experience kind of that environmental safety a little bit more. We don't want to leave it there, right? Like, great, we got them housed. That's really important. But we know that people need to build meaningful lives beyond housing, and sometimes to be successful in housing, because what is it all for, right? I think that's something that we hear a lot. So of course it's strengths based. And it also kind of makes sure we're emphasizing people's cultural identity, agency, and taking a holistic approach to healing, even though, again, this is not treatment, but it's the work that we can do with a person to identify resources, either internal or external, that will help them heal. And so it acknowledges that systemic trauma and trauma from injustice, and it starts to talk about like, okay, what are your strengths? What are your capacities? What are the things that you make meaning out of in your life? What are some things that would kind of like get you excited to wake up in the morning, right? And holding that hope, which Brian touched on, right? That like tempered hope. Like, no, we don't want to be Pollyannish, but we want to affirm that that recovery is possible from, you know, whatever they're experiencing and whatever recovery means to them. And it really, you know, I think when we think of building meaningful lives, we think about relationships and connection, and meaning. And so working with the person on goals that promote that, and then also kind of a collectivism. And so practical strategies for that, again, you might already be doing this, or it might be some food for thought. So making sure people are finding community. So that could be community centers, support groups, special interest groups, like, I don't know, crocheting or whatever it is that a person is interested in, volunteering, faith-based activities, and then maybe re-engaging family or other natural supports when appropriate, when wanted. Connecting folks with activities that reflect their culture. So culturally specific healing practices, wellness practices, affinity groups, cultural centers, advocacy groups or efforts. I think that's something powerful that we underutilize a little bit. So I think a number of the folks that I used to work with got involved in kind of drug user health rights or survivors unions or something like that. And then, of course, acknowledging kind of the systemic factors that are at play in your conversations with people. Like that doesn't feel big, but it is big because someone might not have had that conversation before. And then lastly, of course, practicing humility, right? And examining our biases. I think, and it might not even be bias, it might be burnout, right? We might start to think of people in limited ways when we're feeling really burnt out and stressed and stretched. And so making sure we're checking that, because it's truly the case that we don't necessarily know what someone's capable of and what their life could look like after this experience of homelessness or after the experience of trauma. And so holding kind of that possibility, I think, for people is really important. Any questions there before we move on? Okay. If not, then I will pass it off to Jordan.
If you want to go to the next slide. So I want to ask a question that's a little bit nuanced, but what we've been talking about. So what makes an agency trauma informed? Because I feel like we've talked a lot about like practices and what we're doing, but what makes an agency actually trauma informed?
Encouraging their employees to be trauma informed and to go about their daily business, knowing that you're going to come up with these barriers, and also to make available other avenues to get to the end goal to accommodate those traumas for the clients that we serve.
Yeah, what Casey and Gina both said or put in the message, the agency makes room, makes space for these types of trainings. There's an expectation that this is the base level of how we provide services.
Love asking this question because I feel like we'll always get little pressure points sometimes where we've all worked for an agency that said, we're trauma informed, here's what we're going to do, and then made no space. Some didn't even pay people for training. Some people said you have to do it on your own. So I think we've all worked for an agency that triggers us, right? We're a trauma informed agency. We're going to do this. You do that on your time. Or no, like so I think this is a term that's used often, but what does it actually mean to be trauma informed? It means all of the things we've talked about, but also holding space, making space not only for the training and those pieces, but also for staff, because I think a fully robust trauma informed agency is, the individuals we're serving and the staff. How are we holding space for staff that might have their own traumas, that might have vicarious trauma, that might, so thinking through all of the things that have already come up in this conversation. The agency makes space also that their staff are likely experiencing 100%. We're saying the same thing at the same time. I think that's exactly what it is. And I remember when I first started my career working at an agency that was like, oh, we're trauma informed. And then over the course, we asked that question in the beginning, how has your impression of trauma evolved? I think my impression of trauma informed care has also evolved. Originally, I was like, oh, it's very individual focused. Da, da, da. And then I was like, oh, the agency should also be supporting me. That wasn't on my radar when I thought about it, which I think gets to some of maybe agencies we work for that aren't doing it. It's also setting those expectations. So it's everything that's coming up. It's recognizing all of the practices we've talked about. How are you institutionalizing that in policy and practice to support your staff in moving forward with that? Time off, understanding that staff needs a break just to walk and close the door for a minute. Absolutely. If you want to go to the next slide, I think all of this is, I like this visual. It's a little bit blurry, but it talks about, so there's the concept of trauma inform is your trauma aware, trauma sensitive, trauma engaged, and then trauma informed. So there's kind of a process where you're actually changing your practice. So there's an evolution of what it looks like to be trauma informed. But I think this is 100% what's coming up in the chat of it ensures an administrative commitment to integrating these policies, but it's all, and it's providing training for staff, but it's also providing space for staff, knowing that we're doing really challenging work and that the staff itself, looking at that, realize staff itself has traumas that they've experienced. And so being truly trauma informed is recognizing the pervasiveness of trauma and how it impacts. I think that is also included in staff and how we support staff, and recognizing that staff may have past traumas. They may have had a traumatic experience with an individual they're working with, or they might have a past trauma that's getting triggered working with that person. And I think that happens often in this work. So I think looking at, how are we incorporating the thing that comes to mind is practice what we're preaching, right? Like, how is it incorporated in the agency as well, that we're supporting staff and creating infrastructure and policy to really provide true trauma-informed services for the people that we're working with. Go ahead, Molly.
Can you speak to the bottom right one here, and how you see that operationalizing in agencies? That conducts early and
Conducts
respectful.
early and respectful trauma screening and assessment for all. So there's a couple different ways, and we actually have a couple resources we'll send out that are like, you can do a trauma-informed care agency assessment, and it kind of looks at how staff feel, how individuals receiving the services feel, but when thinking of it from a like individual service facing, there's agencies have integrated kind of universal screening for trauma. I think there's hit or miss in doing some of that sometimes, because you don't want to lead with it sometimes, and so I think it's the implementation of it. You're looking at, okay, if somebody doesn't want to answer this, that's fine, we walk away from it, but that we're asking people questions kind of uniformly, rather than this gets to a little bit of what Teresa talked about, where that person felt targeted because I get put in this room because I'm big and scary, or like I was asked this particular question, but it's not part of their standard process. So they have kind of integrated standardized screening for trauma in a way that's not really invasive. So it's part of like looking at the assessment. So your assessment you're doing, you're asking questions around experience of homelessness, experience. So it's really analyzing your assessment to ensure that it's in trauma-informed language, that it's the script the person is using is looking is in a trauma-informed way, but also looking at how are we screening for trauma and assessing for all, because in some ways you are assessing for trauma, but like secondarily assessing for trauma, talking about how long have you been experiencing homelessness? Have you ever been involuntarily hospitalized? Or all of the things that you might incorporate into a assessment, looking at it and making sure that it's kind of in a standardized and trauma-informed way.
Okay, so it's not like a quiz that a supervisor gives a staff member and then holds their score on.
No.
Okay.
But
Thank you.
the agency assessment also looks at how are you, when you're having individual supervision, how are you And this is where you don't want to screen for all of their trauma, right? Because that's like, you don't need to know that for personnel, but how are you screening for vicarious trauma? How are you incorporating that into their, because there are going to be things that are triggered that maybe are not related to service delivery, but are something in their personal life. And so you don't need to know what the trauma is. You don't need to know, but you need to know when it shows up at work, how do I address it? So that's more like that standard screening process. Any other questions? So we'll jump to the next slide just for the sake of time. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because I think they came up in what we were talking about, but we will share some of the resources. So there's actually, you can conduct an agency-wide trauma-informed assessment. So it looks at your service facing, like, are we doing this in a trauma-informed way? Do the individuals coming in our door feel safe? Kind of assessing from their perspective, but also, Molly, this gets a little bit to the staff piece. Are we assessing for trauma in so much as how it's showing up in the work for staff. So you're not digging into their trauma history, but you are digging up into how is it showing up in your ability to work with a staff member. You don't have to disclose to me what it is, but I'm noticing something here. So more related to supervision practices and how they're screening for vicarious trauma, how they're, if something happens intuitively, something else is going on here. Tell me more about it. And then considerations around physical safety and adopting collective care policies, kind of implementing CQI with individuals receiving services. So thinking kind of from a practical perspective, all the things that have kind of come up, giving choice, recognizing, setting those expectations, but doing it in agency policy and procedure and culture. I think the thing that comes up is really it's about agency culture and how are we promoting it, not only for the people we're serving, but for the people who are working for us as well. We're going to go to the next slide. So all of this, we've kind of talked about it. We're kind of skirting around the issue of vicarious trauma, which I think we could do a whole training on. So vicarious trauma and how it shows up, but the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and daily loss and not be touched is unrealistic as expecting that we can walk through water without getting wet. So I think the reality is in any caring environment, we are emotionally in it because we're committed to the work and that we want you would care about people. That's how we end up in this profession, right? And so making sure that from a supervision perspective, you're evaluating that impact of trauma on staff personnel, that we're looking at collective care policies, monitoring for signs of trauma in staff. So again, with realization, we know what trauma looks like and the signs for it. So then we're looking at how are we evaluating for signs of trauma in our own staff.
And I think also just throwing out there and validating that we talk a lot, vicarious trauma. We all have experienced that. We also experience a lot of direct trauma in this work sometimes. And I think making sure the agency has resources to deploy our policies and procedures to follow up after something directly traumatizing may happen, to make sure people are cared for. Because I think I'd be surprised if anyone in this room has escaped that. There's going to be something that is challenging.
And I think as agencies, even we tend to do really well at kind of the trauma-informed care for individuals, but maybe not as good sometimes at the staff side. And I think agencies that are really doing trauma-informed care are really good at both, right? And so looking at, how are we supporting staff when there is a traumatic experience? To Teresa's point, I've worked for an agency that had a really traumatic event. And so trauma responders came in. We brought in EAP. We had an actual time to address what happened and let's process it. And knowing that you may be somebody who we process in this moment, but 6 months down the road, you're still going to have impact from what happened. And so how are we 6 months later still supporting staff in a way when something traumatic happens or they have a traumatic experience, collectively or individually? And so sometimes, again, linking to external resources. Are there other things that kind of come to mind for you when you think about the management and supervision strategies for enhancing trauma-informed care?
being available to listen and responsive as a manager.
100%. And it's hard, right? Because you have 1,000 things going on at any given moment and just making sure you're available. Yeah, offering someone who is not a direct supervisor to listen if they wanted that as a choice. Absolutely.
The other thing I have seen a lot of lately that I think has been really impactful is like we think about responders. And I remember when I was in an agency, some of the responders were staff that were trained to be responders, and no one would use them because they didn't want to have that conversation with someone that worked in another department. And so there are organizations out there that are like peer responder type agencies. And we ended up bringing one of those in, and it went a lot better because one, they were our peer. We knew they had gone through similar stuff. It wasn't like Jennifer in HR, who we aren't sure kind of what her background is or if she's ever experienced anything, but we have a peer who's coming in who has that kind of work history and who it's relational on a different level, I think. So I think exploring some of those things are really important.
I think like normalizing kind of building a relationship where not to an uncomfortable extent, but just you can keep track of where people are at in their life, because it's November, I had a baby, and I feel like I just became so much more sensitive to traumatic interactions for about a month. And my supervisor at the time just knew that, like, yeah, cool, that's going to be how it is. And we need to just know where everybody's at with the big things in life.
Yeah, 100%. And I think in one of the breakouts they were talking about like, how do we know it's trauma? I'm just going to assume it's trauma and figure out. And I think you when you have context, you can say that might be playing out here, and let's just keep a close eye to it, right? Let's think about what might be happening. And then if you're comfortable disclosing that as a supervisee, the supervisor knows, okay, this is what's going on and what we need to be aware of, because there's going to be triggers that are happening. Empowering the people doing the work to do what they need, giving them time off that isn't counted towards their time off if a traumatic event happened, so they aren't stretching themselves to show up when they're really not able to be there. I think that's 100%. I instituted mental health days where I was like, you don't have to tell me anything. You just need to give me, like, if it's the night before or the day of, give me enough time to make sure I have coverage, but you can text me and say, I need a mental health day. And so staff started using that, and it was, this is your mental health day. Yep. Agree. I think it's that holding that space for there's traumatic things at work, but also individuals have personal traumas that might be impacting where they're showing up. And so again, truly trauma informed is realizing the pervasiveness. And so taking that approach of, I'm sure there is something going on, right? As a supervisor, instead of presuming X, Y, and Z or being upset about something happened, like what else could be going on here? What could be leading to this situation?
I think how do you build that into the workday sometimes too? And, not talking about like hugely traumatic events, but for example, a program I was in, we responded to overdoses all the time, and it kind of felt systemic at some point. But the truth is, it was stressful. It could be traumatizing for folks who either had lived experience and had responded to 100, lost someone. A number of us had lost someone. And so even though that kind of repeated response didn't feel like a huge traumatic event, we would always shut down the program for an hour if we could afterwards, or just take a break so people could kind of just get out of that kind of like hyper-vigilant trauma response. And so I think other little ways to build in breaks, even if it's something that's not so obviously awful, can be really helpful. And it just communicates that we care about people being able to kind of regulate. Or if they can't, let them go home if they need to.
Yeah. And the things that are coming in the chat are, it's 100%. It's the same theory and practice behind what we do in trauma-informed care, but applying it to staff, realizing that things aren't going to show up immediately for some people, that it may show up much later. Important for staff to be available to support, hold space after a traumatic event. Also important for agencies to recognize trauma potential and be transparent about address and prepare staff for it. 100%. So at the onboarding and at the bringing people in, recognizing like this is a really challenging job. Here's how we're going to support you. Here's what we're going to train you with. I think that's true, being transparent with staff about what they're going to encounter, because we've worked with a lot of people who maybe didn't know what they were signing up for. We've had agencies that they're like, I did not expect what was happening here. I had no, and I think in some way this work there, you can't be 100% trained, but you can have a general expectation and understanding what's going to happen. And if something does happen, this is how we're going to support you. So I think that's a great point, Ryan. For the sake of time, I'll move to the next. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, and we'll send a template out for this. I think when people talk about like trauma and vicarious trauma for staff, we talk a lot about self-care. We tend to talk about collective care, and I like collective care from a trauma-informed agency perspective because it acknowledges that there are multiple levels that's impacting a person at any given time. And so there are multiple levels for intervention. So thinking of collective care practices, there are things that are exacerbating or contributing to compassion fatigue at an individual level, at an interpersonal level, at a community level, at the organizational level, at a policy level. And so I've always been challenged with self-care because people, sometimes how it's operationalized is you can just take a day off and take a bubble bath and it'll be great. You can come back and then the policies and procedures are going to be the same. So this is a strategy to really work as an agency, as a team at each individual level. It's an opportunity to work kind of collectively at a team and say, on an individual level, here's what I'm going to do to take care of myself. At a team level, here's what we're going to do to take care of each other. As an agency level, here's what we're going to do to take care of each other. And Ryan, some of your things are often mapped out in those of like, we're going to onboard people in a very intentional way. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to be transparent in the process. So we'll send that template out, but I really like it because it's really an interactive exercise with individuals, agency, and team to figure out how are we going to support you in doing this work in a really trauma-informed way. Let's work collectively to identify those. And that's individual to supervisor and broader team and agency. It's kind of an exercise to really talk through some of this. Is what would it mean to be truly trauma-informed for staff? We will go to the next slide. We're not going to have time for this breakout, but we'll send the slides out to have questions, because I think to have you, if you want to talk among your agency, but if there's things about these questions, I would just be interested to see what are some practical strategies you and your agency can utilize to improve trauma-informed practices. I think there's always opportunity for improvement, even if we're doing really well. And I think that has to do with some of that intentionality. So are there particular things you can think of right now that your agency can implement to really improve your trauma-informed practices?
I'll say I am interested, Jordan, in what you'll share later about the assessments. So yeah, I'd be interested in organizational assessments, as well as sort of trying to think about, like, it's pretty normal now to do like burnout assessments for yourself. You don't necessarily have to share with anyone else on your team. But maybe combining that with some more focus, like, or is it burnout or could it possibly be trauma kind of questions for self-assessment.
Yeah. And there are a bunch of them. We will share a lot of them. And then also the collective care template too. And it's not something you'll have to share outright right now, but I think thinking about it, because again, part of the beauty of trauma-informed work is that it's the intentionality and thinking and kind of resetting, because I think we've all been in a place where we just status quo, running from thing to thing, and we don't necessarily think about why we're doing it, or maybe we skip something because we don't have time for it. And so thinking about, the intentionality and of how we show up. I know we are at time. So Teresa and I will stay on if there's any questions or follow-up, but we really appreciate the participation. We know that you've probably been through a lot of trauma-informed care trainings, and so we really feel like the engagement and talking through what it actually looks like is really helpful with kind of operationalizing some of these practices.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.